Hi, in this video I'll take a look at three things: how MPC Live 2 compares to the original MPC Live and MPC 1, how good its speakers are, and then what's new in MPC version 2.8, in particular in light of the cons in my comprehensive MPC version 2.7 tutorial video. In order to keep this video as concise as possible, I won't repeat that tutorial. I'll link to it below. It applies to all three devices up to MPC version 2.7, and I'll talk about what's new in 2.8 here. With that said, let's get started. Let's start with a comparison. So the biggest feature in MPC Live 2, and I mean that quite literally, is the built-in speakers. I shined a light into the grill here and you can see two speakers on each side that seem to be in different angles. The ones in the corners pointing in a 45-degree more or less up, and the ones further in pointing forwards. I didn't open it up, but I guess the center portion is responsible for the bass because you can definitely feel the bass when you crank it up. I'll show you the results of a speaker test in a bit. Let's take a deeper look at the differences between these three. Obviously, the price, which is always subject to change, $700 for the MPC 1, $1,200 for Live 2, and Live Mark 1 is $1,000 if you can get one new, and about $800 to $900 used according to Reverb. The launch of this may drive it even lower. The next big difference between the three is that MPC Live and Live Mark II have an internal battery. As you can see, they're not plugged into anything, and both can be expanded with an SSD plugged in the bottom, whereas MPC 1 does not have an internal battery, nor can it be expanded with a big solid-state drive. That said, you can expand the storage of all three with an SD card or USB drive. In terms of existing internal storage, MPC Live and Live 2 have an internal drive with 16 gigabytes of storage, whereas MPC 1 has only 4 gigabytes of internal storage. In practical terms, since 4 gigabytes and even 16 gigabytes is probably not enough for the samples we all hoard, either an SSD or SD or USB drive is a must anyway, so I don't think that the internal storage limit is a big deal. In terms of controls, let's start with what's identical. All three have a 7-inch touchscreen and 16 pressure and velocity sensitive pads, with the pads on the MPC 1 obviously smaller. Whether or not that's an issue for you is a matter of individual preference. I'm not that much of a finger drummer and I'm fine with the small pads on the MPC 1. In terms of actual physical buttons, MPC 1 is still king of the hill with 31 buttons. Yes, I counted them. Live 2 is a close second with 27, and then Live 1 comes last with 22. However, and again, a matter of personal preference, I prefer the buttons on the Lives to those on the 1. Now that said, the extra buttons on 1 are quite useful. Here's a little feature request. It would be nice if you could customize the buttons. For example, in a project that doesn't use multiple sequences, next sequence is kind of redundant. So it would be nice if I could assign that to something else, or maybe swapped XY effects from a shift function to a regular function. I really like the program edit button here. There's no program edit button on Live 2. Obviously, you can always access it through the menu or with shift to reach the right screen. And in the case of program edit, it's this one. So you get used to it, but this is more convenient. Let's take a look at connectivity. First, what they have in common. All three have 2 master outputs and 2 inputs, though MPC 1 only has 1/4-inch inputs, and MPC Live and Live Mark II have phono inputs. Though they share the same actual internal bus, you need to choose whether you want to use line or phono on each. However, Live and Live 2 have 4 additional 1/4-inch outputs that you can route to external processing or effects or a cue. Live Mark 1 has 3.5 millimeter headphone outputs, and MPC 1 has them up front. There's a 1/4-inch output for headphones here. Live 2 has a speaker on off switch, obviously relevant only for it because it's the only one with a speaker. All three have an SD card slot. Here on the Lives, it's in the back. On 1, it's in the front. Master out level control on the back on MPC 1 and MPC Live. On Live Mark 2, it's this knob over here. Then CV and gate are only supported on MPC 1 and Live 2, not on the original Live. There are 4 outputs here, but these are CV gate pairs. If you get a splitter cable, a TRS style splitter cable, you can get 2 CVs out of each of these outputs. Then on to MIDI, only 1 MIDI in and 1 MIDI out on MPC 1, 2 pairs on Live and Live Mark 2. The inputs didn't make much sense until version 2.8, but now that you can plug in a lot of MIDI devices, 2 inputs are certainly nice to have. You can connect the MPCs to your computer using the USB Type B jacks. This is USB 2. These are USB 3, which means faster data transfer and access to the internal SSD drive here in the bottom, which you can mount onto your computer. Both have USB Type A jacks to connect MIDI controllers, storage, and so on. Only one here, two here, which is obviously more convenient, though you can connect a powered hub here and connect as many devices as you want with version 2.8. Then finally, in terms of network connectivity, Ethernet link on MPC 1 and Live Mark II, which doesn't exist on the original Live. A connectivity difference you won't see on the back is that Live and Live 2 both support Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, whereas MPC 1 has neither, it's Ethernet only. Let's take a look at some other physical differences in terms of size you can pretty much see for yourself. As I mentioned earlier, all three share the same size touchscreen, and the pads here are smaller. Overall, I find that when using the MPC 1, I'm pretty much always facing forwards, whereas there's a slight left to right motion on the Lives. However, since the screen on MPC 1 is slightly farther away from you if you're sitting down low, the perception is that Live's screen is bigger. While the form factor, again, is a matter of personal taste, personally, I like the aesthetics of MPC 1 more, but ultimately because the touchscreen does get a lot of use in the MPC workflow, closer is better. A final word on size, you shouldn't forget weight. MPC 1 is the lightest of the three, coming in at 2.1 kilos or 4.7 pounds. Live 1 is 2.7 kilos or 5.9 pounds. And Live 2 is 3.4 kilos or 7.45 pounds. So yes, this is portable, doesn't require power, can work on a battery, but it is pretty heavy. All three share the same RAM storage, 2 gigabytes of RAM. As of the current firmware version 2.8, you can't stream audio from the hard drive. If we look at the competitive landscape, there are quite a few samplers that only have 64 megabytes of sample space, which is a small fraction of this. However, there are others like the Deluge, Blackbox, and Octatrack, which support streaming from SD cards. Now, Akai have hinted this feature is probably coming, so it's more a matter of when, not if, the MPC product line supports streaming. Personally, I think 2 gigabytes is a lot to work with. Another difference, both Lives support Ableton Live Control, MPC 1 does not. Okay, let's talk about the speaker. There's no way that I can convey to you exactly how this sounds. If you imagine a sound bar around this size, you'll be able to start imagining what this sounds like. Is it as good as studio monitors? Probably not, but it does have a fun pumping bass, and it can get too loud for comfort, meaning that you don't need to crank it up to get a feel for what you're creating. As of the making of this video, Akai hasn't shared any specs about these speakers, and I don't have an anechoic chamber at home, so I can't test exactly how flat or what the frequency response of the speakers is, but I took Live 2 out to my backyard to measure it. And the reason this works well is because the enemy of proper acoustic measurement, walls, don't exist here. Of course, there are other enemies here, like the neighbor's barking dog or birds, which is why it's always a good idea to take a few measurements, and please take all of this with a grain of salt. Obviously, this is no professional way to measure speakers. It seems like they start kicking in at about 70 hertz, and if you take a middle level between the peaks and valleys, it doesn't stray too far from the plus minus 5 dB either way until about 10K. Then it holds up at a lower level until it drops off completely at about 16K. Now, this is in my backyard. I made a video about measuring your room. Your room with its reflections and modes is probably much worse than this. Now, if we set aside the numbers for a second, like I said, it sounds like a good portable speaker, which most of us casually listen to, which is great, but obviously it doesn't compare to proper studio monitors. One last crude test, I'll point my mic at the speaker. Okay, so those are the differences. Now to complete the picture, let's take a look at what's new in version 2.8, because it seems like Akai have addressed many, though not all, the feature requests people have been asking for a while. Before I move on to the big one, which is multi-MIDI, I just want to talk a bit about a few of the small ones that really bugged me in previous firmwares. All of them were cons in my book, and Akai knocked them out quite nicely. First, a super handy shortcut for changing tracks. So up until now, you had to press the track somewhere on screen and then either turn the knob or press and tap. Now you just hold main and you can choose the track either on screen or using the pads, which is an awesome shortcut. The next thing that really bugged me was that you couldn't know what the Q-links did. Now, that may seem trivial, but actually the Q-links have a lot of multiple modes, 5 of them actually, so they can be in project mode and do different things, program, pad scene, pad parameters, or based on whatever's going on screen. They fixed that with a simple overlay. Once you touch a Q-link, you can see what it does. Now, these Q-links represent 4 out of a group of 16 Q-links. You can hold the Q-link and then page through the different options. Now, if I may be so bold as to ask for consistent behavior along the grid of 4x4 Q-links. So currently, as you press this button, you move either left to right on the 4x4 grid, which makes a lot of sense if it's aligned in columns. But if you're on a page that happens to be aligned in rows, for example, like the pad parameter, then tapping here moves on to the next one in an upward direction, as you can see here. So now these 4 Q-links control these 4 parameters. It would be great if they would just move left to right consistently. The next of my cons, and I'm sure for others obviously as well, that Akai fixed was that pad perform mode was its own thing. You'd go into the menu, you'd find pad perform here somewhere, and then it would work only as long as you were in it. If you're in a few other pages that can play notes, that wouldn't carry on to those pages. This meant that you had to do a lot of transposing with banks if you were in a drum kit or in a melodic program. That's in the past now. Now it really works nicely. You just enter pad perform mode, which is right here, not on the main menu. Then you choose how you want the pads to behave, chromatic or chord mode, notes, all the goodies in pad perform mode, only now it works in a few other places as well. If you're new to MPC with version 2.8, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about, and that's a good thing. Another thing I mentioned wasn't so hot in 2.7 and earlier was the time stretch algorithm. So time stretch is when you've got a tune, this is the original tempo, and you slow it down. Obviously, the more you slow it down, the harder it is to keep it consistent without using too much CPU. Anyway, so slow it down to, say, this rate. You can hear the choppiness there. This is the old algorithm. If we go into menu, settings, and change it to the new one, Pro 10, it is quite a bit better. You can still hear choppiness, but less. Again, let's hear the other one. Again, compare it one more time. Much smoother. Now this supposedly does take up more CPU power. I didn't stress test this. This is one clip. We're at about 10%. And let's go into here. Change it back. Okay, choppier and not very different. 9 to 10. Again, this is just one clip, so potentially more clips will slow it down more, but it's not like it's a major hit. Another neat and helpful function added to MPC 2.8 is retrospective record, basically like Ableton Live's capture function, meaning that your MPC remembers what you play even if you didn't hit record, and if you come up with something you like, you just hit shift record and you can bring that into the active track. So let's see how this works. I'll get into the sequencer here, hit play, and let's say, just moving around, and I like this, and maybe this, but I didn't hit record. Very simple, just hit shift record, and that gets committed onto the timeline. Yet another fun one, you can now program your own custom progressions into pads. To do that, just play the chords in the track, which we just happen to already do. Then go back into main, hit the pencil, tap convert to progression. You can rename it. Let's just leave it at progression 28. You can preview the chords in the progression. Move to chord 2. There are a bunch of other options. Let's just hit do it. And if we go to pad perform, go to progressions, we can then select progression 28. This has been transposed. But those are our chords, and they're of course available on the pads as well. And you can obviously sequence more than just 2 chords. There are other small features I won't cover in this video, like copying pads between programs, assigning custom MIDI notes to specific pads, and global automation and timing correct functions. Let's go ahead and look at the big one, which is updates to MPC's MIDI capabilities. Now, in the past versions of the MPC firmware, you could sequence external MIDI and CV gear from the MPC, but if you connected controllers or synths into the MPC, they could only control the active track. That has now changed, along with a few other things, but the core idea is that you can now connect multiple devices that can send MIDI into MPC, assign each controller to a different track to play the internal synth or sample-based instruments or external instruments. Since I already showed how to sequence external gear in my previous video, I'll keep things simple and control the internal synths. Let's take a look at this setup. I've got Microlab here connected into one USB port in the back, and the Noodler, it's a funky kind of generative sequencer connected to the other USB port, both powered by the MPC. If I had additional USB devices, I could use a powered USB hub to connect them. And of course, I could also use MPC's 5-pin MIDI DIN inputs in the back. If I go into the settings menu and look at the MIDI sync option, right, there are a bunch of options here. Go to MIDI sync. You can see that it's already identified the Arturia Microlab MIDI 1 and named it, by the way, over USB, which is a nice benefit of connecting things over USB. MPC 1 and 2 are the 5-pin MIDI DIN inputs, and then Noodler has 4 USB MIDI ports, each with up to 16 channels. That's overkill for what we need for this setup. I'll just be using MIDI port 1 and multiple channels on that MIDI port. If you connect devices into the MIDI ports, you could rename them here as well. Anyway, if you look at the options for incoming gear, track is the basic option which enables receiving notes from these. Control will let you use their knobs to control parameters within MPC as long as you MIDI learn those parameters. And then master enables a controller to control MPC Live the old way, meaning the active track. That's on the input. On the output side, again, you can send out notes, and I'll be syncing Noodler to MPC's clock. So I activated sync for all of Noodler's ports, and I think that's almost it. Obviously, I'm sending MIDI clock out to Noodler. So that's the overall setup to get these guys talking. Then on a track-by-track basis, you have to tell each track which MIDI device and which MIDI channel to listen to. Now you can see that if you click this little eye over here, you can see which MIDI input I'm listening to and which channel. It's a bit small, but it's workable. That's the MIDI port, and this is the MIDI channel. I prefer the overview in track view. So I've got a pad on track 2 listening to MIDI channel 2, which Microlab is configured to. If I go to track 1, you won't hear anything because Microlab is set to send out MIDI on channel 2, but we can easily move it to channel 1. Then I've got Noodler MIDI coming in on here. Noodler won't work unless I have clock working because I've slaved it. Anyway, track 5 is my drums. Let's mute it for now, hit play so Noodler can receive clock, then go into track view, and we're not hearing anything because I didn't arm this track. So this is information sent from Noodler MIDI port 1 to track 3, then track 4 is this one. I can activate it now that I've got clock. So this is the second pattern. You can, by the way, arm multiple tracks by hitting Shift Arm for the tracks that you want to listen to incoming MIDI, and another new feature in 2.8 lets you arm multiple tracks without holding Shift. You need to change that in the settings. Then the final important piece of information is the options. Here there are 4 options for each MIDI track: auto, merge, off, and in. I keep it on auto here. Off means that only events that are already recorded are heard. In means that incoming MIDI plays whether the track is armed or not, and recorded events aren't heard. Auto means that you hear incoming notes when the track is armed, and the recorded notes when the track isn't armed. And merge is where you hear both incoming and recorded notes. Anyway, the end result of all this is that MPC can now be the brain of a setup that not only tells other instruments what to do, but also listens and responds, which means you can use it as a sound module, like we did here with the various MIDI channels, and even as a MIDI looper. So let's, for example, go into the ARP1 track, hit play. So we've got clock going. This is active. I could always hit overdub to start entering these notes in. And I'll make a perfect loop here and then stop this. Okay, maybe then go to a second track, record this. And then, yeah, keep on going. Then maybe let's unmute my drums. I didn't want to automate that, by the way. Let's go maybe into the bass track. I can practice a bit. And just decide to record. That's basically how you use the MPC as a live looper, both for internal instruments and external ones. And of course I could keep going, say with the pads. Not forget to choose MIDI channel 2. And yeah, maybe record this. I just missed that MIDI off event. Let's hope this fixes itself the next loop around. So it worked, but it would be a good idea to either trim those notes later on or watch for overlapping notes when you create loops. So with all these new features and Akai killing off most of my cons, what's left to complain about? Well, there are still only 2 audio inputs on all 3 devices, so it would be nice if Akai could support expanding those with an external audio interface over USB, so that once you build this as a brain of a setup, you could use it to apply effects, say, to multiple instruments or record and track multiple instruments live into audio tracks. Another thing that would be nice to have is the concept of scenes like Ableton Live and Machine, and there's no arranger, though Akai has hinted that's coming. Finally, something that I don't miss much, but I know a lot of people do, is the ability to stream large samples from the hard drive. Beyond that, on the pros side, the MPC platform just keeps getting better. The MPC One is an amazing value at $700, and now you have a couple more options, either a used MPC Live Mark I for portability without CV control and obviously no speaker, or the MPC Live 2 with the best of both worlds, a speaker that isn't shabby at all, portability, CV gate outputs, almost as many buttons as MPC One, but of course it comes at a price. So that's pretty much it for the comparison between MPC Live 2, 1, and MPC One. If you liked the insights in this video, consider checking out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the bell after subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next one. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.